Hello, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to our annual convention first general session, or what I like to call Kickoff to Convention 2020. My name is Monica Byrne Jimenez, and I'm proud to be the Executive Director of UCEA. I know you're all here to listen to this wonderful panel, so I will keep my remarks short. It's been a difficult few months for all of us, and like many of you, I'm experiencing particular anxiety right now. Knowing that I would be here with you and all of you has helped me keep me grounded and focused these past few days. And knowing that this discussion matters, that our work matters regardless, helps me tremendously as well. I'm coming to you today from East Lansing, Michigan. And in keeping with our values, I want to acknowledge the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples and their continued sovereignty. I also want to recognize that some in this session and many in our communities may have experienced or are experiencing loss from COVID-19. My heart, our collective hearts, are with all of you as you can navigate and continue to navigate this loss. I hope that after this session, you will go to our website, uca.org, and explore more about what UCA Convention offers this year. Our format is completely different, and while we miss being together in the same space, we can still be together virtually. We're starting today's convention. We're kicking off convention with this amazing panel that I'm so grateful for all of you taking your time to be here today. It's also my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutcheon. She is a member of this year's convention planning committee, has done, as part of a team, has done an outstanding job pivoting from what we know to from the known to the unknown. So I'm very grateful for her and the convention planning committee as well. Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutcheon is an associate professor at Lehman College, which is part of the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York City. Rosa, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I feel very privileged to have been part of a wonderful planning team and to be able to introduce all of the wonderful panelists here today. I am sad that we're not in Puerto Rico as we planned, but I am wearing my Puerto Rico Resistencia shirt in honor of that space. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists and our moderator. First, I'll introduce Dr. Naila Suad Nasir, who is the 6th president of the Spencer Foundation, an organization that supports research about education. Previously, she served as a faculty member and the vice chancellor of equity and inclusion at UC Berkeley. And she was a member of the faculty in the School of Education at Stanford University. Her work focuses on issues of race, culture, learning, and identity. She's the author of Racialized Identities, Race and Achievement Among African American Youth, and We Dare Say Love, Supporting Achievement in the Educational Life of Black Boys. She's also the co-editor of the Handbook of the Cultural Foundations of Learning, and has published numerous scholarly articles. She's a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. And Dr. Suad Nasir is also the president-elect of the American Educational Research Association. Next, I'd like to introduce my good friend, Dr. Jamal Bowman, who is the congressperson-elect for New York's 16th Congressional District. That's my home district. He's an educator, husband, and father of 3, and champion of children and working families. Dr. Bowman was raised by a single mom in East Harlem and on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. He attended the University of New Haven, then returned to the Bronx to become a public school teacher. He went on to earn a master's degree in counseling from Mercy College, and more recently an EDD with a specialization in organizational leadership from Manhattanville College. One of Jamal's greatest accomplishments to date was founding and leading a public middle school in the Bronx, the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action, which has a strong emphasis on student voices, holistic education, cultural awareness, and love. And in addition to being a fierce advocate for public education, Jamal supports a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, universal childcare, rebuilding a restorative justice system, free public college, and getting big money out of politics. Third, I'd like to introduce another good friend, Dr. Ann Ishimaru, who is an associate professor of educational policy, organizations, and leadership at the University of Washington. Her scholarship examines organizational leadership, school community relations, family leadership, and equity-based change making in P-12 education. She partners with minoritized families and communities, as well as systems leaders, to co-design educational justice and community well-being. She received the 2017 AERA Exemplary Contributions to Practice Engaged Research Award. And in addition to numerous peer-reviewed articles, she recently published a phenomenal text, Just Schools: Building Equitable Collaborations with Families and Communities, with Teachers College Press. And finally, I want to welcome Dr. Kent Paredes Scribner, who is the superintendent of the Fort Worth Independent School District, where he serves more than 80,000 students and more than 10,000 employees. In support of the district's mission of preparing all students for success in college, career, and community leadership, Dr. Scribner has narrowed the district focus to 3 areas: early literacy, middle years math, and college and career preparedness, which has resulted in significant gains across the district. Under Dr. Scribner's leadership, Fort Worth ISD has seen consistent improvement and has been cited by the Texas Education Agency as one of the top Texas urban districts in year-to-year positive growth. Dr. Scribner began his career in education as a high school teacher, a school counselor in Philadelphia, and went on to become a principal and a central office administrator prior to serving for 18 years as a superintendent in Phoenix and now in Fort Worth. He earned his BA in Latin American Studies and Master in Education Counseling Psychology and a PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies from Arizona State University. Together, he and his wife, Suleika, have 4 children. He's not only a superintendent, but a Fort Worth ISD parent as well. I welcome all of our panelists, the moderator. I encourage viewers to go to the website, to ucea.org, to learn more about our panelists. And Monica, I blanked out for a little bit, so I'm not sure, but certainly Carl said that there will be help in the chat if people are needed. Okay.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm so excited for this conversation today and honored to be a part of it. What a wonderful panel. You all bring such varied and deep experiences as leaders, as former teachers, as scholars. And this is such an exciting, scary, terrifying, important moment in our nation. I kind of love the title of this panel, Radical Imaginings, right? How do we rebuild dismantle education systems in the midst of multiple pandemics? And I think that notion of multiple pandemics is really important. I was on a call earlier with Gloria Ladson-Billings, who talked about the 4 pandemics, right? So on the one hand, there's COVID, a health pandemic, there's systemic racism, there's an economic crisis, there's a climate crisis. So we are nationally at this inflection point. So just so pleased to get your wisdom and thoughts today and about specifically how you're thinking forward about education and the education system that we want to build. So I'm going to start with a question for all 3 of you and ask you each to answer. We didn't decide beforehand who's going to go first, so somebody just jump right in when I'm done. It's been quite a challenging year for our nation, for education. We're all home. Our kids are right on the other side of the door, homeschooling and whatnot. You all out there that we can't see or hear, but we feel you. You may be with your kids making dinner. We're all in this mishmash of home and family and school. What have we learned about education this year in the wake of COVID and national racial unrest, what should our priorities be? So I'm going to ask you each to give a brief response to that. I'm going to call on somebody. Dr. Bowman, you have had a major success this week. You must be on a good high. Congratulations on your successful campaign. We're going to start with you on this one. What should our priorities be?
Well, speaking from the perspective of a congressman-elect in this moment, our schools need massive support and massive investment from the federal government, particularly our Title I schools and particularly for our students with special needs. I think this pandemic revealed how education is interconnected with everything else. Now, as educators, we all know that, but I think many times my new colleagues in elected office do not understand that. It's connected to healthcare. It's connected to what happens with the economy and jobs. It's connected with environmental justice or injustice. And without true investment and fully funding our public schools in an equitable way, schools in urban communities are going to continue to be left behind. So we need more teachers. We need more early childhood providers. We need larger spaces for teaching and learning. We need upgraded buildings and infrastructure for proper ventilation in general, but definitely as we deal with a global pandemic. And we need to be more creative and innovative, like bringing outdoor learning opportunities to bear. I'm hoping to begin to move my new colleagues on these conversations so that they can understand it. But our schools have been underfunded for a long time, and we've funded our schools incorrectly for a very long time, and hopefully this begins to shift that conversation a bit.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Scribner, why don't you jump in? What should our priorities be right now? What should we be thinking about?
Well, thank you again for this opportunity. First, from my perspective, I would agree that during this debate of opening schools and continuing virtually, and what do we do with regard to preventing this public health crisis from becoming a generational educational crisis, it is clear that schools are at the center of our society. The entire conversation here in Texas about reopening society, reopening the economy, spoke about schools as central to the leverage point to allowing us to do that. Still, our responsibility here as a practitioner in pre-K-12 education is focusing on closing academic disparities among our extremely diverse student population, improving student outcomes for every group. As was said in the introduction, we've decided that the best way to move a large district of 80,000 students and 10,000 employees is to do a few things well and not try and spray and pray and not try and do everything, but focus on simply early literacy, mathematics at the middle level, college, career, military readiness at the high school. And the only way we can do that in a large urban setting is to partner with our parents first, with our community leader, neighborhood community leaders, but then also, of course, with our business, philanthropic, and electeds. But from my perspective, I think the job of a school leader in the pre-K-12 setting is to keep your eye on the ball and maintain focus again, so this public health crisis doesn't become a generational educational crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Ishimaru, what say you? What should we be thinking about?
I appreciate Dr. Scribner really calling out the need to partner with families and communities. And I guess I want to say, like, when you ask, what have we learned? I think one of the things that we've learned that families have known all along is that they are central to education. And that racial justice, cultural revitalization, and community well-being are the kind of the aims that we need to be up to when we think about education, and that we can't just be tinkering around the edges anymore, or thinking about inclusion in a system of white supremacy. And so I don't have a whole bunch of policy proposals, but I think one of the things that's really important for us to hold on to here is, like, even if I take it down to this, like, one of the principles I talk a lot about is what happens if we start with families and communities. So yes, schools are central institutions, but actually families and communities, young people, families and communities, those are at the center, right? And so as I think even just about my own family and what I kind of go to in the midst of so much turmoil and upheaval and all of these different crises and pandemics, I think about my grandmother, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago. She was 99. She was born in Oregon, and she was incarcerated with the rest of our whole family during World War II in Aurora, Arkansas. And she just is a reminder to me of this idea that we have in the community about gaman, which is this idea of like fighting on, continuing on, persevering. And I was just reading a wonderful youth author who was writing about it, and she described it as gaman, the ability to hold your pain and bitterness inside you and not let them destroy you, to make something beautiful through your anger with your anger, and neither erase it nor let it define you. So to me, that idea is really powerful in thinking about whatever happens with this election, with all of these different dynamics. We've got work to do. And if we start with the families and communities, especially those who've been most directly impacted by injustice, they are going to be the ones who are going to be able to know how to move and how to make these things happen, because there's no one district leader, no one policymaker or elected official who knows what's best for all of the kids in our country. But the kids and their families and those communities if they're able to determine collectively for themselves, then we can go beyond listening to them, and we actually can begin to open up and begin to lead with them. So I think those are some things that we're learning.
Yeah, thank you, Gaman. That's very, very powerful. And on the note of holding internal bitterness inside you, we just had an election, and we don't yet know the outcome, but it's inching towards a potential Biden-Harris win. Some of us may have another window open where we're checking election results kind of as we speak. So given the likely outcome of Biden-Harris taking office, I'd love to hear your reactions, your educated hopes about what we can expect for education coming out of this election, out of this administration. What do you anticipate to be the national education priorities and focus, and what opportunities and obstacles do you see? And Dr. Bowman, I'm going to start with you as the person closest to kind of this federal government machine around education. What do you expect from Biden and Harris on education?
Yeah, I think machine is a very good word because that's exactly how it operates, and unfortunately, too often it keeps out parents and people on the ground when they should be bringing more parents in. I know there's going to be a focus on higher education, specifically around student loan debt, as well as making public college, 2-year colleges and trade schools free or affordable. I know the student loan debt is part of the Biden agenda, literally canceling up to $50,000 of debt for everyone who has a student loan. That would be huge towards boosting the economy overall and just giving others the opportunity to build wealth instead of paying back debt. So I know higher education is a focus. I just want to caution, if Democrats do not win the Senate, we're still going to have a huge uphill battle towards getting certain policies passed in Congress. There's some things that Biden and Harris can do through executive order and administratively, but in Congress, between the House and the Senate, it's going to be a battle because Mitch McConnell just doesn't move bills. He just wants to appoint judges. So higher ed is going to be a focus. I'm hoping, and part of my agenda will be early childhood education and universal child care, particularly from birth to age 3, to provide families with the support and reprieve that they need, while also making sure that we focus on those first 100 days of school. which are 1,000 days of life, which are key to brain development and particularly in communities that have been historically ignored. And I know many of my colleagues are going to be focusing on the same area, early childhood education.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to hear. And I think you're right. Like it's depending on what happens with the Senate, and it's not looking good. Last I looked, that's quite a potential obstacle there. And interesting, our education system is so decentralized. To think about what we can accomplish at the federal level versus what's best accomplished at the state level, at the local levels, is kind of interesting to think about as well. I wonder if Dr. Ishimaru or Dr. Scribner, any thoughts to add on this point around what we can expect from the election or what we can do at different levels?
Go ahead, Dr. Scribner.
Go ahead. Thank you. Yeah. Just briefly, you're much more articulate than I am, so I'll go quickly. Briefly, I just want to say too, I do believe that additional investment is absolutely necessary. If we're going to make up from this COVID learning loss, we really are going to have to invest, particularly in our youngest learners. Our preliminary benchmark data indicates that our students have lost significant learning as a result of virtual instruction for the last almost 7 months, particularly pre-K, K1 and 2. My colleague in New Orleans reminds me that it took them about 4 years to catch up after Katrina. So investing in pre-K-12, investing in teacher quality, connectivity, and devices is an absolute need in many of our economically disadvantaged portions of our urban centers, and of course also here in Fort Worth.
Yeah, that issue of connectivity feels so basic right now. Like at the very least, we should be able to accomplish broadband and devices, right?
Right.
Dr. Ishimaru, anything to add there?
Yeah. I think one of the things that is really standing out to me right now is as we just look at the results, no matter how it falls out, seeing how divided we are, how many folks in our country how many millions of folks are okay with aligning with the forces of white supremacy, and what do we do with that? How do we reckon with that? So it isn't the only thing, but it is a data point, right? And then we also have this summer and beyond, the movement for Black Lives and Indigenous sovereignty, and those are data points as well. And so I guess as I think about just adding to what you all have said, I think the resources are enormous. And as we think about the coming economic crisis, recognizing like we have a movement of youth that are working to decriminalize our schools. We've got the defund police movement. And part of what they're saying is, yes, we need more resources, and we might need to make some hard decisions about how we're using those, how we're allocating the resources we do have. And I think the danger sometimes is in thinking that the election, one way or the other, is everything. And that the formal processes of governing is everything. And I think that we all know, but have to sometimes remind ourselves and not get seduced by that, given how prominent this is right now. But that we have lots of things that have to happen. We have lawsuits and policy. And then especially I want to just emphasize that, we've got movements on the ground, and we've got leadership that's unfolding. Sometimes outside of the school structures, but then also the formal leadership that's happening, that is really reshaping how we are making decisions, how we use data, how we consider data, what do we think of as measures that matter for our schools and for the well-being of our students, and how do we make the decisions about resources, about organizational structures, about personnel that are happening at the very local levels as well. So yes, these broad policies matter. And they can they play a big role in either blocking progress and change, or being levers for us to make change. But just to remind ourselves that also there's a lot happening as well at these different levels. And I think especially as we think about our kind of decentralized system of education, how much we can shift and change on those local levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, very important points brought up, particularly around the concept of police-free schools. That's huge, and our youth across the country and other activists are organizing for this here in New York City and in every corner as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is key because this is part of the reimagining of public safety and public health, and looking at what really enhances and supports our learning environments and inspires our learning environments, as opposed to having school safety or cops in our schools. Pivoting towards social workers, pivoting towards counselors, pivoting towards music and arts and sports programs, pivoting towards food justice and housing justice. This is all a major part of the conversation, and what's really key is these grassroots organizations holding elected officials accountable if they're not responsive to their demands and to what they've been organizing around. Our campaign was a major part of the grassroots movement, which helped us to be victorious, but this needs to happen all over the country. Let's support candidates who work in alignment with the grassroots, as opposed to have an adversarial relationship with the grassroots. So that's a key point.
Yeah, that's huge. And it's huge, kind of huge right now. I was struck by the fact that in many of the cities nationally where people successfully advocated to defund school police, that those were places where that grassroots organizing had been happening. And then it built on the wave of kind of this national movement. But it's almost like a collaborative / contentious relationship between systems and grassroots organizers, that there's a push that happens that's really important to inspiring these systems to change, especially when there's this national wave that says we all need to be thinking about this differently. So I'm going to head back to you, Dr. Ishimaru. I want to ask you specifically about the role of families. I know that the center of your scholarly work is with families and communities, about the kinds of education they envision for their children. What do you see as some of the most critical insights from this work?
Well, I think we all know that there's huge inequity that has unfolded in the wake of the remote learning context. We were just talking about the access to technology. There are disproportionate health impacts and multi-generational families. So, I think one of the things to just kind of hold in this moment is, I've been talking and listening to families of color in particular, and especially Black and Indigenous families are saying, yes, this has been hard, and they have seen how their children have been disproportionately impacted by all kinds of things like that. And at the same time, if we can also hold that many of those children have been thriving at home, that they've been happier at home. And I think a lot of times educators are surprised and dismayed to hear about that. But many of these families that I'm hearing from are saying, our kids are not having to deal with the constant surveillance, the sort of white normalized educational expectations that result in kind of policing of their behavior. I'm not saying it's not happening at all. It's still at play in the digital space, but they are not living it every moment in the school spaces. And so I think that that's something that we have to really, really reckon with as educators in schools, and think about, all right, so some of these folks, you ask them and they don't want to go back when the school reopens. And I think Dr. Scribner may have alluded to some of that a little bit earlier when we were chatting ahead of time, when we have this big move to get kids back into schools. And I think we all want kids back in schools, right? That's sort of, not contested. But when you ask families of color whether they're ready to send their kids back to school, given the resources, given the space, given their trust in our system, many of them do not feel comfortable sending their kids back to schools. And that's often something that's being driven by more privileged white and sometimes other privileged families. And so I think that that's something we just have to be able to hold and recognize that there's some actually learning that's been happening. And so when we frame the conversation solely about learning loss, we overlook the the powerful learning that is happening in schools and homes. And then we have to think really carefully about how do we ensure that our return to school, one, isn't happening absent the priorities and voices and experiences of families of color who are most impacted by these injustices. And that, two, that it's actually not a loss for them to return to school, that they are having culturally embedded, often intergenerational, community-based, social, politically embedded and relevant learning that may not look like the learning we have in school. But how do we think about ensuring that we can bring some of what they have been learning and doing back when we go back to schools?
Yeah, that's a great point. I have a son that's a junior in high school and is not in a hurry to go back for the very reasons that you cited. It's his day is not bombarded with the level of microaggressions that he normally has to deal with. I'm tired of making lunch, but that's a different story. Wondering if, Dr. Scribner, you had any thoughts around this issue of families and centering families and how we reckon with the things that young people might be learning at home that won't show up on the school assessments.
Absolutely. I mean, I was a high school teacher in North Philadelphia and a high school counselor there, principal in South Phoenix, and I understand that schools cannot be successful without a true partnership with parents and community. We must listen, learn, and then lead. And those experiences have really been helpful moving forward into kind of managing these large systems at the superintendency level for the last 19 years. But clearly understanding, the contextualizing what's gone on with regard to school reopenings and COVID response is all about racial equity and all about understanding that the large portion, 89% of our student population are students of color. Their voices were being drowned out by a smaller, much more affluent population who was actually leveraging incorrectly their perceived needs of folks who, on the other side of town to achieve their goal of coming back to school come hell or high water. So it's not a theoretical, it's a real life experience, and I've got the scar tissue to prove it.
Yes, I imagine you do. Dr. Bowman, anything to add on this point?
No, I echo everything my colleagues mentioned. I do want to mention, there's been a challenge here in New York City in particular, of truly accounting for the needs of students and families who are learning remotely. Many of those students and families rely on some of the consistent systems that are in place in our schools, like breakfast and lunch, for example. And it's been hard to account for which students still need breakfast and lunch and how to get it to them, from the school or from another resource. And I wrote an op-ed recently about childhood hunger, just echoing what was mentioned in a CNN article. And there is infrastructure in place from the federal level side, and the resources are there, but actually identifying who has the need and getting them the food has been a challenge as well. And in New York, I believe we have about 140,000 children who live in shelters, and disproportionately high number in the Bronx. So that's just, how are we truly capturing what the needs are, whether it's remote, whether it's hardware, whether it's food, whether it's psychological, social, and emotional, and then how are we, meeting those needs? What can the school do in terms of working in collaboration with the Department of Health and other agencies to just communicate need and then meet the needs of families? So that's another takeaway, like the collaboration that's needed to really make a community school context work. Hopefully we'll begin to put some of that in place, because throughout my 20 years, it hasn't been in place nearly enough.
Yeah. And it's never been more apparent how much that infrastructure needs to be in place and how much of those needs are kind of landing at the school and the district's door. On that point, and just to dig into your scar tissue a bit, Dr. Scribner, you've been a leader and a superintendent in urban districts for many years. You don't look it, but wondering what you can share with us about systems change in education. How do we create educational systems that disrupt inequality and serve students from the communities that are being hardest hit? What advice do you have for other systems leaders?
Well, the first thing is that it's not easy. I tell our young leaders that, conflict is the DNA of leadership. If you don't like conflict, then go back to the job you had 2 or 3 jobs ago. Perhaps less compensation, but a lot less conflict as well. So that's one. Second, organizations, we're talking about systems change. Organizations, it occurred to me 18 years ago when I was a baby superintendent, that organizations are made up of people. So if you want to shift an organization, you have to get to the hearts and minds of those who are serving the children and change the context and change the culture. That's about hiring both quality and diversity. I don't want quality without diversity, but I don't want diversity without quality. And we need to be very deliberate about finding both a leadership team and teachers who reflect the students they serve. High quality leadership team. I've always strived to surround myself with people who are better than me. But in Fort Worth, the interesting context that we have here is we, in fact, despite being one of the, as we compare to the other large urbans in Texas, Houston, Dallas, Austin, and others, we do not have the most progressive leadership in our city as compared to those other urban centers. Yet we had a board who was unapologetic about establishing a racial and ethnic policy outlining institutional racism that exists right here in our school district, stating that the responsibility for addressing these disparities among students rests with adults, not with students. So taking responsibility for that, but it's much more than establishing a department. The worst thing you can do is establish a department, pass a policy, and say you've achieved something. We really haven't. It's a question back to the original point about community conversation and listening to parents, listening to community, creating a safe space, talking about the emotional SEL impact that this systemic institutional racism has on our students, staff, and community. As I was talking about earlier with regard to the COVID response, creating a mechanism where those the 89% of our student population, students of color, 85% economically disadvantaged, providing them space so that they can have a voice, inviting them into the conversation. We have subcommittees on academics and segregation, discipline, our COVID-19 response, recruitment and retention, hearing from our students, their home experiences, counter narrative in our social studies curriculum, LGBTQIA students of color and their schooling experiences. So really, taking the game to them, so to speak, and recognizing that there will be and has been significant pushback. We just have to create a system in which folks understand why we're here. We are the largest district in the county. We serve the most diverse student population that is rich in diversity. And my consistent message to our community is we want to move away in Spanish from the pobrecito mentality, where we pat the kids on the head and wish them well. We have to move away from remediation, move to acceleration. Change the narrative that urban students are not problems to be solved, they're assets to be invested in. And despite many folks in our city not jumping on board in our last tax rate election that passed Tuesday night, we felt it was a bold initiative and necessary if we're going to create an urban district that functions today and in the future.
Yeah, really, really important work. It strikes me how it must be to kind of build attend to these brand new and old equity issues at the same. So there's this crisis moment, and then these long-standing equity issues, and there's all of this need and all of these stakeholders, and figuring out how to change things and move things while you also provide stability must be just an impossible to be managing.
I mean, it's complex and it's different, but it's also simple and easy. I mean, every political question is about who gets what, when, where, and how. And so the question is, how do you navigate that system and make sure those who are in the greatest need from an equity lens get what they don't get the same, they get what they need.
Yeah, yeah. Either of you want to jump in on this? Any thoughts to add?
I'd love to just add in. I think one of the things that happens all the time is that and you said this too, Dr. Scribner. There's just like the rationale of equity, and those who are greatest need are get what they need. And I think that's a crucial idea. Often, who gets to decide who those people are and what they need is not those people themselves. And so I just like when we think about systems change. I actually just did some writing about this in terms of like the wave of equity policies that we're seeing across the country in many districts. And then there's a move towards equity teams. And one of the things that I actually went after a little bit was this idea that we're going to change everyone's hearts and minds first. And then we're going to make these other kinds of changes. And then I think that we can think about that differently, that maybe hearts and minds have to change, and we need to actually change some of the fundamental ways we go about business. So maybe we need to change our organizations, the structures in the organization. Maybe we change the organizational routines for how we make decisions and who gets to be part of that decision. Maybe we change what we conceptualize as data and how we use that data, whose voices count as part of that data when we think about closing schools, about allocating resources, and all of those kinds of things. And so I'm always I have a lot of folks that I teach and support in systems leadership work, and really thinking about how do we go beyond trying to appeal to people's hearts and minds, and also think about how do we embed this in our organizational structures and in the way we go about the work.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
That's good.
Yeah, I would just add, there's an amazing organization. They're national now, but I believe they started in Chicago with Jitu Brown, the Journey for Justice organization. And they've been pushing for 25,000 community schools across the country. And we adopted that as part of our New Deal for Education. And the idea is a collaborative leadership infrastructure that includes parents, teachers, administrators, and students, and really has a bottom up, for lack of a better term, feel to it, where decisions are made based on the needs of the community, and the people from that community are central to the decision making. That's what a true community school is supposed to look like and function as. So when we talk about a radical imagining or restructuring, that has to be part of it. I mean, right now the system is very top down, and it's been running like that for forever. And now it has to be more inside out, more bottom up. And again, I want to go back to how we fund our schools and the need for huge federal funding that needs to come in support of this reimagining. Institutional racism manifests in policy, and it manifests in our spending and where the majority of the money goes. And, if you're a poor person of color, you're more likely to go to a school that's underfunded and live in a community that's been redlined. And those things have to all be a part of the conversation as well. Community integration, home ownership, food security, jobs, school funding, and then a community school infrastructure, all part of the conversation.
Yeah. But that starts to take us to where I wanted to go next, which was, we're using this term radical reimagining or radical imagining. And I've been guilty of this myself, talking about how important it is in this moment to think bigger, to think more broadly, to reimagine schools. How do we get there? What does it really mean to reimagine and recreate education systems anew, as opposed to just tweaking kind of current broken systems? Like, from each of your vantage point, what does that reimagining look like, and how do we get to it? Like, what are the concrete steps to move towards this reimagining? Anybody want to jump in first on that?
I'll take a crack at it. I think, again, what Dr. Ishimaru mentioned about organizations being perfectly designed to get the outcomes that they're getting. We know that. So if you want to change the outcome, you have to change the design. I live in the real world, and my experience has been adults respond to incentives. And so what we've done here is identified dollars from the general fund and incentivized our best principals and our best teachers to work in zip codes and specific schools that have historically been underserved and have historically underperformed. And the question is maintaining a stable governance structure so we can continue that moving forward. We can have a short run of positive success, but I guess back to the original point about mobilizing community and creating that external pressure, so that when you do make these equity-driven decisions with regard to resource and other aspects of equity, that it can sustain over time.
Yeah, great point. Jamal or Ann, anything to add about how we get to the reimagining?
Yeah, I have a lot to say. I'll let Ann go first.
All right. Well, I have a lot to say on that too. I think, and this is always the question, right? It's like we can sort of think about. I think here's where we get in trouble is we try to think about like, oh, let's like reimagine this out of nothing. We tend to reimagine what we already have. We kind of replicate the colonial logics, and maybe it looks like there's like fresh paint on it or something like that. And so, like I actually wrote a piece with a group of parents recently, and before I did that, I didn't really understand how much was going on that parents were already doing, that communities were already doing. So there's a group of African American moms in our region who are actually doing kind of like they're sharing resources and they're kind of like supporting each other, but then also like actually teaching each other's kids. There are Somali refugee communities who are actually like calling back to Somalia and getting help in math and Arabic and Somali. And so just I think one sort of concrete thing is to think about like first getting a real sense of like what are all the creative things that have already unfolded in this moment. Well, I think we see it as kind of like it's all or nothing. It's like we had school and then we had nothing. But to really have a clear sense of like what did unfold here, what is the learning that we can build forward from. And so I think that's one thing. There's also, my work is about this process of co-designing. And so when we think about reshaping our decision-making processes, whether it's about how we're gonna hire new principals, or maybe it's about what's the racial equity policy going to be. I think there are ways that we can really shape those spaces to bring in the kinds of expertise that we haven't had before.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes, I agree with all of that. And I would just add, I've always been an advocate for implementing the multiple intelligences in our schools and outside of our schools and other learning spaces. I mean, I think it would be awesome if every child had an opportunity to learn an instrument or participate in the arts or play a sport or engage in horticulture and gardening. I think we need to increase resources there. I mean, the schools that I've taught in throughout my 20-year career, like rarely had these programs at all, which is completely unacceptable in my opinion, because that's how, I'm all about holistic education, holistic development, and you need to bring in a robust, diverse, cross-curricular approach if you're going to really unlock the potential of all our kids in different areas. Another area that I think is important is the area of adult literacy. We have many moving into our communities from a variety of backgrounds that maybe didn't complete their education where they came from and want to engage in education here and learning spaces here. And I think we need to do a better job in our schools, K to 12, of providing adult literacy opportunities as well. So those are just a few additional thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So in order to do this kind of change that we've been talking about at the district level, at all levels, we need educators and leaders that are going to be able to be ready to kind of take on this work of creating new systems, of supporting new ways of teaching and learning. How do we prepare the leaders that we need to change education in the ways we've been discussing today? What's missing in our current models, and what are we doing well that we can build upon? Dr. Scribner, I see you look, you want to jump right in, so I'm going to ask you to jump in first.
I may get bounced from this call, but what I don't need is another degree issuing program wanting me to partner with them and subsidize their program to create more master's degree in administration. What I do need, for example, we have 35, 40 assistant principal jobs. We'll have 400 applicants. So I don't have a shortage of assistant principals. What I do have is a shortage of quality principals. And we're running around, we're busy. We have a full-time job out here in the field. And it would be really, really helpful if we could leverage the university's expertise, the conversation that's going on right now. Let my team identify 20 or 25 sitting assistant principals, and then create a cohort where you all come in. I can pay for the professor to come to half of however that works to come in and help them understand the contextual, the intellectual, what we're talking about here today, and prepare them to think differently to become leaders. What happens is we have a system where we're clogging it up with quantity, and I would much prefer to sift through that and deal with quality. So if there's an opportunity to partner with college universities here in North Texas or anywhere now that we can do it virtually to help me train up sitting assistant principals who we select, who we understand, who are culturally competent, who are reliable, who are dependable, who got it, and then you all can make them smart, and then we can put them in the principalship.
So, Anne, I hear that as a direct challenge to you and your people at universities. Any thoughts and reaction?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that raises, I love that idea. I think one of the things that it raises is what happens, especially with educators of color, and what that means in terms of who gets deemed like principal material, or even I think like the National Association of the Superintendents, ASSA, just came out with their study, right? And we know that. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now. I think it was around. We're talking about like in their sample, which isn't everyone, of course. It's about 8% of them are superintendents of color. And then of those, we've got, they asked them whether they were prepared to address and talk about issues of race and equity. And about half of the superintendents of color said that they felt well prepared. About 80% of the white superintendents said they were not well prepared, or really not well prepared, or they were not prepared or very much not prepared to have those conversations. And so I think when we think about the formal hierarchy of leadership, we really have to think about what does that mean to assess somebody as leadership worthy, and what happens. Actually, we know that there's a kind of assistant principal ceiling. We have disproportionately a lot of, especially Black men, who end up getting put into the assistant principalship because it's one that's seen as having something to do with behavior. And sort of policing behavior, and then at least I don't know the national statistics on that, but I know in our region that's an issue because there are not as many of them moving into the principalship. So I think we have to think about that, the entire pipeline, and thinking about what does it mean for educators of color. We've got a lot of moves across the country to hire educators of color. Which I think is terrific. And we have to also think about what does it mean to retain them. And we know that leadership is crucial in maintaining and sustaining those educators of color, both in terms of them staying in the profession, staying in their buildings where they have the connections, but also enabling them to realize and build from the assets and the practices and the knowledge and the relationships that they bring in the door, because we also know too often when we bring in educators of color, new educators of color, our system shuts those things down. So I think we really need to take a hard look at how we're sort of making those decisions and the assumptions that we're building into that. And frankly, we need a different paradigm of leadership. We've just had 4 years of a kind of strongman form of leadership that's all about the singular individual who knows everything and makes all the decisions, right? I think that if we can start thinking about, especially like there are indigenous conceptions and other communities of color have very different conceptions of leadership. And if we were to center some of those, we might think about the kinds of things that Dr. Bowman is talking about in terms of, Edwin Mayorga did an interview of a community organizer recently. She talked about a web, and that the role of a leader, a formal leader, isn't to sort of like make all the decisions, to be at the front of that. It's to actually help weave and strengthen that web.
That fits very much with what you were talking about, Dr. Bowman, a little bit earlier around the need for coordination. And then if that's true, if the coordination is really at the center, then coordination is a function of leadership, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And to this question, which is a great question, I really want to challenge my education colleagues to demand more from our elected officials. I mean, our parents, our teachers, our superintendents, our principals, they make miracles every day with limited resources, and they build infrastructure with limited resources, and they've done all the research and the studies and what we need to know to move forward accordingly. It's already present in the research. But our elected officials aren't leaning into the science, aren't leaning into the research, aren't engaging with education stakeholders. So they're drafting policy that does more to meet the needs of the wealthy elite and corporations and the idea of social Darwinism than it does to meet the needs of our kids. So I really want to challenge my education colleagues to hold elected officials accountable to be more responsive to parents, more responsive to our most vulnerable kids, but bring in additional resources, and don't take no for an answer, and don't accept that we don't have the resources, or don't accept people crying broke when we just gave $1.3 trillion to Wall Street and Jeff Bezos is worth $200 billion. Like that's unacceptable. It's never been acceptable. It's unacceptable now. And let me say this: the parents are the sleeping giant in education, in terms of, if parents demand more from elected officials will move immediately, because parents have the credibility of lived experiences. Educators have a similar credibility. So when educators speak, elected officials will listen and respond. But we often are not as aggressive as I think we should be towards demanding change and demanding resources. And what educators need more is resources. They got the mind and the heart and the experience to do what's necessary once the resources come in.
Great points. I want to ask you a little more to elaborate, because you said two things that struck me that I think are really important. One, that parents and families should be comfortable demanding what they are needing from their elected officials. And I wonder if you could say more for folks in the audience who might be parents. What does that demand look like? How does one make that demand? And then the second thing, and you might want to weigh in on this one too, you talked about the role of research. That makes me so happy as a person who leads a foundation in education research. And one of my kind of shticks for the past couple of years has been, we do this research, it sits in the ivory tower, no one's reading it, it's not impacting what's happening in the world. And maybe because it's not super useful in current form, what would you say to researchers about what they should be doing differently so that the research is more impactful?
So first, with parent demands, right? So in my school, we had an open door policy. Parents can come in any time and meet with me at any time. There was also structures in place like school leadership team and parent association, where we had very live and engaging dialogue. But a parent demand is a parent walking in and saying, Mr. Bowman, I need to talk to you, and screaming at me from down the hall that she needs to talk to me, and saying, what the F is going on with XYZ? And demanding to see me, and me going into my office and hearing her out and listening and having a conversation, figuring out what the issue is, and then solving the problem. That's one example of that, right? There are many parents have told me over the years that they've never had the opportunity to engage with school leaders in that way, because school leaders always cut themselves off from parents. It would be maybe an assistant principal, maybe a counselor, maybe a social worker, but not the actual school leader. When it's the school leader, parents feel much more invested and engaged. And even though I've had arguments with parents where we would both leave the argument in tears, and the next day we would hug and love each other, because that was the kind of community we built. So that's key. And if a principal is not providing that opportunity, then that parent needs to go up the ladder to superintendent, to chancellor if need be. I had parents go to the chancellor and me as well when I did something or wasn't as responsive as they wanted me to be. And this is great, right? Even if that parent was wrong in their presumptions, the fact that parents felt empowered to do so was key. And it's not only in schools, it's with elected officials as well. And in terms of research, too many of my now colleagues in Congress, they do not feel that they are accountable to their constituents in their district. They do not feel that they're accountable to children. They do not feel they're accountable to scholarship. They feel that they are accountable to corporations and the wealthy elite. And not to bring too much politics into this, why do they feel that way? Because the wealthy elite control what happens in our political system through fundraising and through funding of candidates. So as long as they can raise money from Wall Street and fund their campaigns for re-election, they're not going to look at any of the research in any issue that they're dealing with. Now, obviously, I'm generalizing. There are many people who are elected officials who do this. But when you look at the policy that comes down and you're wondering, why the hell doesn't this meet any of the needs of the kids that I serve, is because they're not thinking about the kids that you serve. They're not thinking about the scholarship. And obviously, as someone who received an EDD from Manhattanville College and focused on community school collaboration, I had to review a ton of research to write my dissertation, and literally found studies from like the 1950s on racial equity and racism and implicit bias and everything we're talking about now. It was there then. So I'm going to encourage my colleagues as well to follow the research in whatever area, follow the science. I mean, look at how Donald Trump is responding to the science when it comes to climate change, and not just him, others in Congress as well. It's absurd.
Yeah. Any thoughts from you about research and how people in schools and school districts and policymakers can better utilize research, or how researchers can make their research more useful?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask Dr. Bowman that how we felt like the kind of research could be more useful. I think a lot about this, especially because I'm in research practice partnerships with a couple of districts. And so really thinking, and we've been pushing really to think about those as research community partner practice partnerships. But really thinking about shifting our paradigm as well about how research works. It's not something that happens, over here in the little corner, and then we we do our academic papers, and then we then try to translate it into something that's actually useful. And then we go, hey, how come you're not using our research? But actually generating that together with folks and reorienting the way we think about the role of researchers. And I think that we as researchers have to reckon with the ways in which our own, our training and our socialization and all those kinds of things are kind of at odds with the kind of shift that we need to see in terms of the role we need to play as well in that web, and to be walking with communities and working with schools and districts and educators in generating, yes, the knowledge we need to contribute to the field, but also the practices and the visions and the measures and the outcomes that we want to see. And so I think, what you've said really resonates with the need to kind of shift our paradigm in terms of research as well. But then also, like you talked about, like the angry parent, right? And I think that so often especially when they're parents of color, there's a kind of racialized set of assumptions that get placed on those parents. And in ways that don't happen to the white parents when they bring up issues and are advocating for particular things. So really being able to see the kind of collective action and the community organizing and frankly, the problem parents as resources that are bringing their expertise. One African-American mom that I've had the privilege of working with, she's like, look, one of the things we learned during COVID was we have PhDs in our children. And I was like, that's so right. And that's a resource and a source of expertise that we disregard and then try to put it in these little boxes of like, go sell, cookies and raise $10 for the PTA.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, Dr. Scribner, anything to add on this point about parent effectiveness and how parents can lobby for the kind of change they want to see?
No, just absolutely. I agree entirely with what's been said. We just have to create the space and create the climate so that there is a two-way flow of information. And again, systems have to incentivize that and reward those schools that are engaging parents. One of our systems here, based on survey data, based on qualitative data about parents feeling welcomed on campus. That's something that we should be measuring as well, and supporting those campuses that are doing that successfully.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I want to, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me say one thing, and I'm going to turn it to you because I should have said this. I want to invite the audience members to type questions into the chat. So we're going to turn to your questions in a bit. And so get the questions flowing. All right, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Anne's point is an excellent point. How are we making the research more accessible to lay people, right? How are we making the research accessible to kindergarten students and teachers? That's key. Accessibility is incredibly key. And, that's a language piece, that's a relationship piece, that's a connection piece. It's not just scholarship for scholarship's sake, right? It's scholarship that should lead to intended outcomes. And, if we don't, as putting my scholar hat on now, if we don't, as scholars, make it accessible, the people that we want to see it and benefit from it may never benefit from it. Because we didn't make it accessible. So figuring out what that looks like can be an opportunity, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, thank you. So before we turn to the Q&A, I would like to end this portion on a hopeful note. So could each of you say a bit about where you find joy, where you find hope in the current context?
Yes. I have a 6-year-old daughter. That's it. That's the answer. She's awesome. And as long as she's around, I'm good. Also, I have 2 other kids. I don't want to leave out my sons, Marcel and Jelani, who are 11 and 19. So they provide a ton of hope. And, and I just ran for office and, had no idea how it was going to turn out. And people were very responsive, and we not only won, but we won big. So that and we tripled voter turnout from the previous primary. So that's huge and very hopeful. And I think what's hopeful to all of us and our audience is the fact that I was an educator for 20 years and had a EDD in education leadership. That gave me a sense of credibility as I ran the campaign. That was just huge and invaluable. So that's why I encourage everyone here to, not run for office. I mean, of course, if you want to, please do so. But it's so important from parents to hear from you about education, like off the record, like offline. I gave people the opportunity to ask me questions that they probably never had a chance to ask, a school principal. So that's what made it more relational and more powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Who else wants to jump in? What's giving you hope right now?
I'd just like to say Well, first off, I am really pleased that I chose to be a practitioner, as you guys are unbelievably impressive, and I'm hanging in there, keeping up with this conversation. But I would like to say that that what brings me kind of joy about this work is understanding that public schools really are the most important institution in our society. It's where we find out about excellence and equity and efficiency and choice, and the work that we do. I mean, COVID really called that out. Called out the disparities on connectivity, called out the fact that elections absolutely matter. And now that I finally have kind of figured this job out after 19 years in this seat, it doesn't feel like you're going to work anymore. I feel like I'm just trying to make Fort Worth a better place for my family and for my neighbors and for everyone.
Yeah, I feel that deeply. It's such a beautiful thing to be able to live your mission when it's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your thoughts, Anne?
It is a full contact sport.
Yeah. Well, what's beautiful about what you just said, though, too, is that you're really schools are central, and it's also about the community that you're in, right? And trying to make that a better community, and I think that's beautiful. I'm also really inspired and hopeful because the youth are all right. Turns out, as a parent, I tweeted this earlier. Is like, trying to explain to my kids what was going on and what is going on in terms of the election. I mean, they get the mechanics of it, but they're like, wait, how many people think what and are okay with what? And my 10-year-old was watching things come in the other night, and got the TV on, and he points out and he says, Mama, just wait till my generation is old enough to vote, because we are done with this. And I was like, all right, okay.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And I think,
yeah,
right there, but the youth are organizing. They're clever with social media. They're ready for these conversations. The teachers in my kids' school are doing a year of Black Lives. We're talking about Black trans lives this month. And, it's hard. It's imperfect. It's on a screen, but we're trying. And the kids are ready for it. And, my daughter did this stuff over the summer where she was learning about the history of revolutionary movements and doing digital art with Asian American Art Museum and kids across the country. And there's community-based organizations doing all this stuff. And it's just like the youth are the ones, they are on fire. They are writing things. They're doing art. They're doing poetry. They're doing music. And they're growing up in a time that I think makes some of us feel overwhelmed and sometimes a little bit hopeless. But the youth are on fire, and they got this.
Yeah. Great. So we have a couple of good questions in the chat. I'll just start at the beginning. So right now, Biden has 253 electoral results, and Trump has 214. I thought it was 264. They're still not sure if they're counting Nevada or not, huh? How are you all feeling? What are you thinking?
I'm hoping Biden's going to win, and we can get to work. Again, the Senate is key because Mitch McConnell doesn't want to collaborate, doesn't want to pass any bills. So that's going to be tough. But getting Trump out, I think, is a huge just uplift emotionally for the entire country, for the immigrant community, for the Black and Latinx community, for the LGBTQ community. It'll just be a huge sort of emotional uplift, I think, for all of us if Biden is able to pull us out.
Yeah. Others have thoughts they want to share? If not, we have other great questions. I'll just jump in. So the focus of the panel was on inequitable education systems, yet everyone noted that inequitable schools are rooted in broader social inequities. In other words, without a political and moral will to make society more equitable, schools will always be inequitable spaces. So, oh shoot, my thing is moving. So how do we move towards changing society, particularly in a political climate that pines for the good old days and yearns to make America great again. So I think the question is really about these issues we've been talking about set within this broader context. How do we impact the broader context? How do we think about that?
I'm going to start it. I'll go on some of the organizing and the community organizing. One of the things that really struck me for some of the folks who are doing education organizing, yes, they think schools are central and really important institutions, and because of especially the kind of decentralized nature of that, it's a grounds through which folks can learn leadership and power. And that becomes an avenue for leadership and power in other realms. And as long as we don't take those as singular issues, that we are after the complexity of where these things are coming from, schools can be a starting place for those broader things, and can be a ground through which folks can develop their understandings of the system and its roots, can develop relationships and power to influence change, and can exercise leadership.
Yeah, thank you.
I would also just add too, from my chair, my values, my skills, my experience are absolutely irrelevant if we don't have stable governance and a school board who cares about these issues of equity and of addressing the institutional injustices that exist. So your point earlier about grassroots, elections matter. And board members, particularly here in Texas with single member boards. So we have 9 board members, each representing a slice of a 209 square mile pie. And in Texas, I don't know if, I'm sure you know, our neighborhoods are very segregated. So I have very different perspectives. In fact, very few are concerned with the at-large conversation. So grassroots, electing school boards who are focused on the right things will allow the system to operate better in this way.
Yeah, and I would just add, hold elected officials accountable. Consistently engage with elected officials from the school board to Congress, and determine how you should hold elected officials accountable based on the result of those engagements. And engagement is empowering, to Anne's point. It's very empowering, not just reaching out to an elected official, but knocking on doors, talking with others about the same issues that you're having in a particular school district, leafletting. So a lot of things that can be done that are incredibly empowering. But ultimately, those elected officials who aren't responsive, whether they're on the school board or otherwise, they'll see you as a threat if you hold them accountable and vote them out of their seats. I mean, that, once we get the right people on the school board, on the city council, in the county office, in Congress, conversations begin to shift and change. So let's hold all of us as elected officials accountable.
Yeah, beautiful. There's 2 questions for Dr. Scribner in particular. I'll read them both, and you can kind of figure where you want to go. The first is, when incentivizing educators and their leaders to address equity issues in your district, are there partnerships in place with surrounding universities or outside of that sphere that subsidize continuing education or other professional development opportunities? Or were you speaking in terms of salary increases or stipends? First question. The second, not unrelated, can you expand on your response about how we prepare principals, specifically speak to the types of skills and mindsets that you'd like future leaders to cultivate and display? And how are those ideas aligned with the formal state principal standards, for example, in Texas?
Okay, apparently I struck a nerve. So with regard to the first question, we don't yet have partnerships at the university level with regard to our racial and ethnic equity policy. Our chair, however, is the professor in critical race theory at TCU, at Texas Christian University, Dr. Max Krochmal, who does a wonderful job. We are really working with our partners through Courageous Conversations, Glenn Singleton's work, and that kind of is guiding what we're the direction we're moving with regard to culturally relevant pedagogy. Understanding the historical perspective of race here in Fort Worth, kind of contextualizing that. And then with regard to principal preparation, I absolutely agree that we can identify a cohort both of quality and diversity representing our student population. And then from my perspective, really focusing on moving away from the requirements of certification, because I think that's where we get into the institutional problems, where we're reinventing the organization as it already exists. What I'm talking about is more on the interpersonal, the cultural competence, the understanding of the community that we serve. I always joke that I did my undergraduate in politics with Paul Wellstone in Minnesota, did my PhD in policy, but I did my master's in Philly at Temple in counseling psychology. And of the 3 degrees and of the 3 skills, counseling psychology was the best preparation for this role. Because what do you do as a leader? You motivate people who need it. You de-escalate conflict. You reframe. Sometimes people come into my office and they fib to me. So I need to understand all of that. And those interpersonal skills are absolutely necessary to be successful. So the kinds of university help I would ask for our principals assistant principals who already hold their administrative certification. Maybe it's from the College of Education, maybe it's from the College of Counseling or the College of Business, or multiple perspectives, a lens to prepare leaders. And again, one size perhaps doesn't fit all. Maybe each cohort, we identify what their needs are and move from there. But it would have to be done collaboratively, and I would lean on our university partners a great deal.
Yeah, wonderful. I want to make sure you all are have access to the chat, because I'm not asking all the questions. And there are some wonderful comments in there, just appreciating each of your contributions and appreciating this conversation. So I'm going to do one last question, and hopefully it can take 1 or 2 of you to answer it quickly. The questioner asked, one thing I think I know is that we need to work together as researchers, policymakers, and community members to navigate these multiple pandemics, but it's hard. How do we foster more meaningful connections across these stakeholder groups? How can researchers be more connected to and learn from the community, or more engaged with policymakers, and vice versa? So any quick thoughts on this?
Anne.
You've been nominated, Anne.
Well, a starting place, right? It's just like, as researchers, we have a kind of privileged space to be able to have some flexibility to actually go to people. We don't always have to do everything on our, use our protocols and all kind of stuff. Actually walk with some of these folks in their day-to-day lives, right? Go with the policymaker, go to the district office, really understand what are the problems of practice, what are the issues right in front of folks. Spend some time with some families, and the research is there. The theory is there. We can bring certain kinds of tools to it, but we also need to be careful not to just impose those on people. I think too often what we see happening is people have here's my research agenda, here's my proposal, here's my IRB, boom. All right, give me access to whatever, your inner thoughts or the district meetings or whatever. And I think that one thing is, for at least speaking as a researcher, we can actually think about how do we move in solidarity, not to do my research agenda, but to figure out what's happening in communities, what's happening in schools, and then how do we help folks learn and grow and get better.
Yes. So there's a question. I got to sneak one more question.
Okay.
One more question, and then I'll come back to you, Jamal, because this person pasted it in twice. So I want to make sure we get to this question. It's for you, Anne. She says, your work is so phenomenally inspiring to her as a doctoral student studying decoloniality and abolitionist pedagogies. She's got questions for you. What are some ways to work not just on the recruitment and retention of leaders of color, but also build the resilience of leaders of color? How can non-Black and non-Indigenous leaders of color show up as accomplices in dismantling the colonial logics, as you put it. So in a minute or less.
I missed a word that you said in there. You cut out. I think you said, how can we build their resilience? Resilience. Yeah. You know, Dina Simmons wrote a piece recently, and I can't remember, maybe it was Ed Wake or something like that, about, you know, we have educators all across our systems, including leaders, who are, you know, trying to do self-care, and we're trying to figure out how to hold them and all this kind of stuff. But she's like, you know what, part of what I need is systems that don't damage me all the time. And so trying to think about, like, especially, you know, there are many white leaders as well who are in this work, and actually trying to think about, what does it mean to decenter myself and my worldview and my way of doing things, which, I mean, our systems are deeply embedded in a set of assumptions about how things should proceed. And that's hard work, right? To try to, one, become aware of how much your own worldview and way of being is centered in an institution of power, but then to also think about, like, what are some other ways, and how do I participate in supporting, and as this person said, being an accomplice to those efforts. So I'm not going to go out there as the person who's going to, like, I'm going to tear everything down, right? But, like, if I'm like a white male, knowing that when I say something and I sort of help move some things around, that's going to have a different impact if somebody else does it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I want to move to just final comments. Anything else you'd like to say before we end today? We're in the final couple of minutes. I do want to note there's an appreciation, Dr. Scribner, for your work with LGBTQ students in the district in particular, and your advocacy, some appreciation there. So Jamal, I'm going to go to you first. Final words, final thoughts.
This has been great. Thank you all so much for having me. I just want to, you know, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it's very important for education leaders as well as scholars to engage with elected officials consistently, and, you know, come with curiosity, come with respect and humility, but it has to happen, and elected officials have to be held accountable. That's how that's one way to dismantle the structure of institutional racism and rebuild a new system. And as we engage with parents, to Ann's point, come with respect and see our parents as scholars, as assets to their reality, and leverage that and work with that to, again, rebuild new structures and new systems. So thank you, and let's get to work.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Scribner.
Yeah, I would just say that the comment that struck me the most during this session was, I think, yours around accessibility. And, you know, from my perspective, there's so much great scholarly work, but I don't have time to read it. And it would be wonderful if there was a way to, you know, break down these very complex and great ideas into a digestible bite for those of us, as we were saying earlier, to parents, to school principals, to everyone. It's for me, that my takeaway is accessibility to your scholarly work, I think, is something that we can all do better on.
Yeah, great point. And it's our responsibility to do that. Anne, final words.
I think two things. One is, if I could put something on the table, it would be about data and measures and how we're using those in accountability at a federal level, and then how that trickles down to local levels, and just to invite and encourage and challenge folks to use this moment to push on the ways we've been doing that, because it fundamentally constrains the kinds of possibilities that can emerge. I think the other thing is just to kind of, I wanted to close with this excerpt of a poem. I was at a NAD Spencer panel that one of the panelists shared this poem by Dana Smith, and it's called My President. She talks about the 11-year-old black boy, Colin Kaepernick, Rihanna, my mama, the grandma, the trans girl down the street, the single moms, the weed dealers, the teachers, the meter maid, all these people. And she says, my presidents, my presidents, my presidents, my presidents. Show me to our nation. My only border is my body. I sing your names, your names, my mighty anthem.
Beautiful, beautiful, and a fitting end. Thank you all so much for your wisdom, your grace, your innovation, your hard work, and just invite all of you in the audience to continue the work, the thinking, the scholarship, the leadership, the policy making, and just grateful to you all for this wonderful conversation today. Take care, everybody.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.